Welcome to the Right Time Podcast. The Right Time with Bomani Jones.
This is The Right Time on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app. No Bomani Jones. You got Sarah Spain and Nick Friedell in today. We are presented by Progressive Insurance. Lots of NBA news today. Tons of NBA news. So a good day to have Nick Friedell, our buddy, who's used to covering the train wreck that is the Chicago Bulls, spreading his wings and getting to talk about some successful teams or were successful. We'll see how all these moves affect the Rockets, the Clippers, and the garbage fire that's the Knicks. It's time for Straight Talk, brought to you by Straight Talk Wireless. Best phones, best networks, no contracts. So the big news, Nick, obviously, the Clippers have traded Chris Paul to the Rockets. And at first it seemed like, wow, Chris Paul, what a great guy. You know, he was going to be an unrestricted free agent if he didn't re-up with the Clippers. And instead of just leaving them with nothing, he told them he wanted to go to the Rockets. They get to make a trade. They bring back a bunch of pieces in exchange for him. He really did good by LA. And then you realize that, in fact, by re-upping with the Clippers and having them trade him to the Rockets, he then gets to keep his bird rights. And next year, he'll be in the same position he was in this year, where he has a potential to make that giant, about $205 million 5-year deal with the Rockets if he wants to. So really smart move by Chris Paul here, Nick.
Sir, it pays to be at the head of the Players Association.
Right. He knows the CBA back and forth.
That's right. It pays to be at that table. It pays to be one of the main voices that the union listens to, and it's something that Chris Paul had to have known in the back of his mind was possible. At first blush, when you see what happened, you go, okay, maybe this makes sense for the long haul. What's going to happen with this contract? But you're exactly right. The money's going to be there. And as always, it seems in these last few years, the player has so much more of a say than he ever has before in this league. And Paul knew that the Clippers were going in a different direction. He saw a chance to get over to Houston. I think he made that very clear to the Clippers officials in the last couple days. And not only now is he on what serves to be a much better team this season, but he's going to get every bit of those dollars that are coming his way.
So it's Beverly Williams, Decker Harrell, Kelly Liggins, Quarterman, and a 2018 first to the Clippers for CP3. There's a small protection on that first-round pick. So obviously Chris Paul, incredibly dynamic player, by far the best defensive point guard that's out there. Based on ESPN's Real Plus Minus, he was the NBA's second most productive player on a per-minute basis last season, behind only LeBron James. So if you have forgotten how great of a player he is, or if you hold against him the fact that he hasn't been able to, alongside his compatriots, lead the Clippers past the second round, you put him in a new situation, and it could be an incredible pickup for the Rockets, except to say, Nick, I'm kind of interested in how this affects what we now know as the magic potion for the Rockets, which is Harden at the point. Look, they both can play off ball and score. They both can obviously play point, but the assumption here is obviously Chris is going to run the point and Harden's going to go back to off ball. And what we saw last year was that when he was in possession most of the time and when he ran the offense through him, that was the best success that they had.
Sarah, maybe I'm an idiot, but at first blush,
probably, yeah.
But at first blush, when I saw how this deal went down, on paper you look at it and you go, oh, Chris Paul, of course your team is better. But with Paul and Harden, two ball-dominant guys, two guys that love running the offense and getting up and down the floor, I'm skeptical as to how this is going to work. Because I'm with you. When you watched Houston last year in that Mike D'Antoni system, Harden was very comfortable making everything happen. When you've watched Chris Paul over the years, both in New Orleans and Los Angeles, he's the guy that likes making everything happen. I'm not so worried so much about the ego part of this, because I do believe that both these guys are pretty close and have got to know each other over the years. But from a basketball perspective, who's going to have the ball in their hands when the game is on the line? Who's the guy that D'Antoni's going to trust to get everybody else in rhythm? And if indeed, as we both think, that Paul becomes the point guard, how does Harden adjust to being the guy who doesn't have the ball in his hands all the time again. I mean, those are things, if you're Houston, that you have to take the risk of in adding a player like Chris Paul, but those are the things that would scare me as I was going into next year, knowing how reliant both guys have been in needing to have the ball in their hands to make things happen.
Sarah Spain and Nick Friedell filling in for Bomani on the right time today, talking about the Chris Paul trade to the Rockets. Micah Adams, who works in NBA content for ESPN Stats and Info, tweeted out today that Chris Paul's teams have played at a pace slower than league average in 10 of his 12 seasons, never inside the top 5. Now, of course, that's not Chris Paul necessarily dictating style. That's the coach, that's management, that's the rest of the teammates that he has. Do you think, Nick, that it's an effortless switch for him to transition from having one of the slower than league average almost every single year to switching to D'Antoni's system?
I don't think it'll be that tough, Sarah, just because when you talk to a bunch of different players around the league, they all tell you, especially the point guards, that they like playing fast. And I think that the envy that a lot of guys had last year in seeing the D'Antoni system yet again in the league, but seeing it work at such a high level with Harden, I think guys want to play like that. I think they enjoy getting their shots up. I think they enjoy getting their teammates involved. One of the most beautiful things about watching the Rockets play last season was the ball movement and getting everything in rhythm and getting quick shots up. When you have that ability for Chris Paul, a guy who hasn't been able to play the same way with Blake Griffin, with DeAndre Jordan over the last few years, with that core group with the Clippers, when you get that chance, I think it's going to liven him up a little bit. Again, my fear would be, though, that always both guys, Paul and Harden, have built careers on having the ball in their hands at all times. And now one of them
is an important distinction.
Yeah, very important. but now one of them's not going to have that pressure. Is it going to free each of them up in their own way? Or are there going to be times when the offense doesn't have the rhythm that it had last season when everything seemed to be up and running for Houston?
Michael Eaves from ESPN had some interesting thoughts about Chris Paul's departure from the Clippers. And I think over the last year plus, it's sort of been this ticking time bomb where we've said, for whatever reason, this iteration of the Clippers isn't getting it done. You like to look at it on paper. You think that they have a real chance to make some noise, and then it just never ends up working out. And for me, it was always that the Blake Griffin piece was going to be the best one to get rid of in terms of his style of play and the direction the NBA is going in. Despite him putting up good numbers, it felt like that would be the most obvious. Now the Clippers readjust their plan, and their focus is entirely on trying to keep Blake Griffin in-house. But Michael Eaves' point was that there was a relationship issue between Paul and Doc Rivers, and it had gradually been deteriorating, and it really, was a part of the reason that he felt confident in wanting to leave. And so several members of the team, according to Eaves, felt like Austin Rivers, Doc Rivers' son, was entitled because his dad was the coach and president of basketball ops, that he never really tried to fit in, that he got it easier than the rest of the guys, that Doc was less likely to criticize him. And the real sticking point, the straw that broke the camel's back for Chris Paul, particularly, as you mentioned, a guy being as smart as he is about league goings-on and trades and the CBA and everything else, how to put a team together, was a proposed trade that would have sent Carmelo Anthony to the Clippers last season, Melo and Sasha Vujacic in exchange for Jamal Crawford, Paul Pierce, and Austin Rivers. Doc ultimately said no to that, turned down the trade, and Chris Paul felt as though keeping Austin Rivers on the roster was then more important to him than the greater success of the team. And that lost his faith. And so that decision for Chris Paul was not only, listen, I can keep my bird rights and keep myself available for this 5-year, $200+ million deal, or 4-year, $150 if that's what he goes with. By going to the Clippers, by going to the Rockets, I can also get myself out of what appears to be a dead-end situation. And I think at this point, there was no other choice for him or for the Clippers than to shake something up in that team.
Well, they had to, Sarah. I mean, this team just wasn't good enough. Let's be honest. They've had chance after chance with the talent they've had in place, but the Doc and Chris Paul angle here is fascinating because in the beginning of that relationship and in the last few years, it always seemed like those two were always on the same page, that they knew what they needed from each other and they knew how they at least wanted to build the team. And so if that's the case, as Michael reported there, that there was some friction. I mean, teams can't win when there's that kind of friction. When you don't have that trust in your head coach and you don't trust the front office, and in this case, Sarah, as you well know,
it's the same thing.
It's the same guy. When you don't have that trust, you have major, major problems. And so for any issues there might have been in the locker room because of that, maybe they did seep out on the floor. Now, I'm with Doc in this sense. In acquiring Carmelo, I don't know how much better you get. In fact, I'd make the argument you may not be that much better at all. But if the sticking point was, I don't want to let go of my son, absolutely that's going to have an impact on the locker room.
Incredibly
and it makes sense as to why Paul would want to be out of there.
Right. And also, I'm curious whether you think it's a good idea to have your coach also be the president of basketball ops. There are a few situations where I think you feel comfortable with that. But if things go wrong, or if you feel as though there's a disconnect there, that's a whole lot of power to be wielding.
When things are good and everybody's winning, Sarah, there's no problem. But
right.
those situations are few and far between.
And
when
it certainly
you have
was not the case with the Clippers from what we've seen so far.
The Right Time with Bomani Jones.
Sarah Spain and Nick Friedell sitting in for Bomani today. ESPN Radio is presented by Progressive Insurance. Last year, over 3 million drivers switched to Progressive. Call or click today and find out if you can save. We'll talk to Mark Spears from The Undefeated in a bit. We'll chat with Ramona Shelburne later in the show as well. Also, Mike Wise. So much NBA news today as the Clippers say goodbye to Chris Paul. The Knicks say goodbye to Phil Jackson. And Nick, you and I were hosting my show, Izzy in Spain, last night, talking about how the one time James Dolan decides to be a kind of stand-up guy and follow through on his promises. And I said I'm going to let Phil Jackson finish out his tenure. I'm not going to meddle with his decision-making. Was the worst time for him to be a stand-up guy and stick to his word, because it had become clear long ago that this was a toxic relationship and they needed to get rid of Phil. Well, this morning they did. He had 2 years left on the 5-year deal he initially signed in 2014, $12 million a year. He was averaging about $50,000 a day working for the Knicks, falling asleep while watching guys work out, hanging out a couple states away while his team was blowing up, antagonizing the star of the team and trying to force him out, and potentially floating the only good choice that was made during his tenure that he didn't agree with when they originally drafted Kristaps Porzingis. So I don't need to tell you, Nick, how much of a mess this tenure was, but I wonder, how do you, as someone who works in Chicago and works with the Bulls, as I'm a Chicago person, how do you balance the guy that we knew that won 11 titles as a coach with the guy that we've been presented with, by all accounts, as a GM? It just doesn't even seem like the same person.
So I think it's another reminder that front office executives have an extremely difficult job. And just because you're a great coach, or in Phil Jackson's case, one of the very best pro coaches in any sport of all time, it doesn't mean that the transition is going to be easy to being a front office person. And we've seen it time and again, but with Phil, people thought it was different because he was so adept at getting guys to check their egos at times. The Michael Jordans, the Scottie Pippens, in later years, Kobe and Shaq had success under Phil. You thought no matter what pops up in New York, Phil Jackson would be ready for it. And in the last couple of years, it just seems like nothing has worked. The Porzingis pick is the only thing that clicked, and even in the end, that's blown up in his face. So every time Phil tried to put something together, it just kept blowing up in a bad way for Knicks fans and the organization. And I think for all involved, Sarah, this was the move that had to be made, because it seemed like this relationship was already completely over with. The only thing that was keeping it together was the contract and the money that Phil wanted.
Right, and the promise that Dolan had made, which he now has figured out the better of. I think Trey Wingo put it best today. The best days of being a boat owner are the day you buy it and the day you sell it. The best days of Phil Jackson's tenure with the Knicks were the day they hired him, and everyone was excited, thinking they were bringing in the Zen Master, someone to turn around a franchise that's long been waiting for that title. And then today, when they say goodbye to him. And the only good day in between was the drafting of Porzingis, which at the time drew tons of boos and criticism. He ended up being a successful a player and a good choice, but even that was not Phil's choice. He didn't want Porzingis. Spike Lee also had a reaction today, posting a photo holding up his hands in thanks to God for finally ridding them of Phil Jackson. As I said, I don't need to tell you how bad they were, but these two stats will tell you something. I mentioned Micah Adams from ESPN Stats and Info. Over the last 3 years, Knicks won 29 and a half fewer games than expected compared to Vegas preseason over-unders, the biggest underachievers by far over that span. So they did not put good use of their talent. And then 538 has an article about how much the Knicks overspent on their veterans. And they use something called their Carmelo projection system. And the 7 most significant players that Phil Jackson brought in or re-signed to New York: Carmelo Anthony, Derrick Rose, Joakim Noah, Aflalo, Lee, Lopez, and Calderon. They made or will make a combined $253 million from the 14-15 season to the end of the 19-20 season. Over the same time, they will have produced $134 million of value. So they overpaid by half on their veterans. And you and I know that when that Rose and when the Noah deal, we were yelling across the country to the Knicks fans, don't get your hopes up. This is a terrible idea.
It's almost unbelievable, Sarah, when you start breaking down the numbers, not only what Phil gets paid and will now continue to get paid off that contract, but yeah, I mean, the Noah deal is going to go down as one of the very worst in NBA history. I mean, and Phil signed off on it. Phil made that happen. And there were a lot of other moves and contracts that weren't good. But this is why, again, you can't elevate these coaches, no matter how much success they've had, into some line of thinking where you go, all right, they're going to succeed in anything.
Well, some of them can. Some of them can. The problem is that. Well, let's listen to Stephen A. Smith, because this morning on Mike and Mike, his point was that Phil was never cut out for this job and didn't even want it.
Phil Jackson never wanted the job. He had told confidants while laughing that this guy Dolan just keeps coming back, won't leave him alone. He started out at $6 million, went up to $7 million, then $8 million, then $10 million. Phil finally got to a point where he said, I can't say no to the money. That's what this was always about. It was never about doing the job. It was about getting paid while doing one job and one job above all else. And that was giving cover to James Dolan, who was feeling the heat, so much so that people literally were planning on boycotting and protesting outside the corridors on the streets of Madison Square Garden.
Right. So, I mean, he just kept throwing money at him until he said, all right, fine, I'll take it. So he was never fully invested in it, at least according to Stephen A.'s opinion. And we saw even early on there were questions about why isn't he around? You know, why isn't Phil there living in New York day to day, being a part of this team's operations? And so I think you're right. There's certainly coaches that we can't presume will be successful, but we've seen coaches move on to front office and be successful. This seemed like it just never fit.
And Sarah, my question after listening to Stephen A's commentary, and it would go towards Phil too, how much money is enough? I mean, didn't this guy already have tens of millions of dollars based on what he had done for the Bulls, winning all those titles with Michael Jordan, and then going to the Lakers and winning all those titles with Kobe and Shaq? I mean, how much is enough to not dent, or in this case, severely hammer your legacy? I mean, how much do you think now he regrets even taking the calls and going through the motions of the last couple of years?
Right, and we'll discuss later what we really think about his intentions with that job and how it's affected his legacy. But you're right. At this point, obviously, both he and the Knicks fans especially would like to erase the entire tenure.
The Right Time with Bomani Jones.
Welcome back to The Right Time on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app. This is The Right Time and the wrong hosts. Bomani Jones is out, Sarah Spain and Nick Friedell filling in. You can always tweet us on the 1-800-Flowers.com Twitter feed. Guests join us on the Shell Pennzoil Performance Line. Nick, don't forget this Saturday, exclusively on ESPN and ESPN Deportes, it's the Battle of Brisbane. Manny Pacquiao will defend his WBO welterweight title live as he aims for his 60th career win, facing Australia's undefeated #1 world-rated contender Jeff Horn. The Battle of Brisbane this Saturday, July 1st at 10 Eastern, exclusively on ESPN, ESPN Deportes, and the ESPN app. Let's go to the Shell Pennzoil Performance Line, where the undefeated's Mark Spears joins us. Thanks for making time for us, Mark.
I know, y'all interrupting this penalty shootout between Portugal and Chile.
You're not the only one watching that. The control room is abuzz with the tension.
Oh, okay.
Let us feel free to interrupt any answer you have with a long, extended call of goal. We'll grade you. We'll grade you on it.
I'm glad America's paying attention now a little bit, I guess.
All right, so let's start with Chris Paul. He and his bird rights are headed to Houston. Clippers get a bunch of guys back in the deal, and Paul gets to be eligible to re-sign in the summer of 2018 for that 5-year, $205 million deal if he wants. We talked about it earlier. Chris Paul's teams have played at a slower than league average pace in 10 of his 12 seasons, never inside of the top 5. How do you see his transition into D'Antoni's offense?
Well, one thing I think that is attractive to what Chris saw in Houston, believe it or not, is seeing James Harden play point guard. He likes playing off the ball, and I think especially now as he's getting a little older in his career, and he and James are basically going to be co-point guards. They'll be sharing it, and it gives Chris a chance to be more dangerous offensively, and so I guess you kind of got to pick your poison offensively and really not know who's going to lead the offense from time to time, because they're both going to be, from what Chris expects, from what I was told, expected to have point guard duties. And, he considered San Antonio, but I think the up and down of what's going on with LaMarcus Aldridge perhaps hurt the Spurs. Is he going to be there? Is he not? I think that played a role. Also, keep in mind, I think he and Tony Parker are good friends, and maybe that played a role in it as well. But I think it was more the LaMarcus thing, and obviously with the Clippers, if you want to beat Golden State, that's probably the last place in the league that seems to have a chance at doing that. They've been drilled at by Golden State the last couple of years, so I think with that, his relationship with Harden, relationship with two former teammates, Bobby Brown and Trevor Ariza, who played with him with him at the New Orleans Hornets, he felt Houston was the best place to be.
Mark, speaking of relationships, at the end of Chris's tenure with the Clippers,
man, you can't just start talking and what's up, man?
How you doing?
You got to come in with this.
Take him to dinner first,
deep,
Nick.
Man, you coming in here all deep and everything. We having a deep off.
Yeah, this is like Barry White's. Should I talk like this?
Yeah, you're always going to knock me off in that one. But all right, I'm glad to see you're doing well. It's good to hear you. But when we go through the breakdown here of how Paul has ended up in Houston, how much of an impact was his relationship with Doc Rivers and the deterioration of it in some circles? How much did that factor into what's happened now?
Well, Michael Eaves had some really, really interesting stuff to say about it, and on his Facebook post, and he covered the Clippers as a television host for several years, so he's certainly familiar with what's going on with the Clippers, and I think he people close to Chris kind of beg to differ on what's said. I had never known that, Doc and CP had a big issue over his son, but, Michael Eaves put it out there. There's got to be some kind of truth to it. So I think ultimately it was what I was told at the end of the regular season was Chris wants to be at a place where he could win. And I don't know that the Clippers were that place anymore. Blake Griffin can leave, and they haven't been able to do anything in the playoffs for a while. So I think he felt like if he's going to make a change, now was the time to do it.
Talking to Mark Spears of the Undefeated on the Shell Pennzoil Performance Line, things are getting a little savage for DeAndre Jordan, who, of course, was kidnapped by Paul and Griffin and other Clippers players to make him stay
bad,
in LA.
right? He should be bad.
They demanded his loyalty, and now
can I tell
Paul
a
is
story
gone.
that it kind of reminded me of?
Right.
When I was covering the Nuggets, I remember this crazy story where Antonio McDyess was like sequestered by the Nuggets as a free agent in the old McNichols Arena in the snow, with the snow going outside, and the Suns had like a limo with like Jason Kidd in it and Rex Chapman, and they're like all trying to like convince McDyess to come back to Phoenix. And Dan Issel had told the security to not let them into the Pepsi Center. Into the McNichols Arena. They couldn't buy a ticket or anything to not let them in.
Wow.
And so Nick Van Exel convinced McDyess to return to the Nuggets, sign a long-term deal. Well, in the midst of that long-term deal, Van Exel asked to be traded.
Oof. And
he ended up being traded to the Dallas Mavericks. And years later, I talked to Van Exel, and he told me that one of the several regrets during his interesting career in the NBA, but the one that perhaps was on top of that list was asking for a trade after he had convinced McDyess to stay there.
Yeah.
And that kind of reminded me of this, where those guys fought and clawed and went to Dallas or Houston, or where I think they were in Houston, and Cuban was outside trying to knock on the door and to convince him to stay. And then, they both could end up leaving him.
Yeah.
Mark, as we figure out where the Clippers go from here, in the last few weeks there's been so much chatter about LeBron potentially ending up in L.A., whether it was with the Clippers or with the Lakers. How do you think this move that the Clippers have now made impacts what they may be able to do next summer in potentially going after LeBron?
Well, I think that the Lakers are still the more attractive option. To me, with all due respect to the Clippers, I can't see LeBron in a Clippers uniform. He'd probably want to have the mystique of being a Laker, all the championships, the statues outside. I wrote that the first Clippers statue might be Chris Paul, and maybe that's in jeopardy now after this decision. But if LeBron's going there, it's got to be to the Lakers, and the Lakers seem to be putting themselves in a position, salary cap space-wise, to bring LeBron and possibly Paul George, who wants to be there. So next summer could be more interesting than an already crazy summer this year, and I wouldn't be totally surprised if that ended up being the case.
Thanks for making time for us, Mark. Good stuff, and we'll keep you up to date on the latest people being held hostage and otherwise.
All right, have a dog for me in Chicago.
The Right Time with Bomani Jones.
Nick Friedell and Sarah Spain filling in for Bomani today, bringing you all the latest NBA news. We'll also get a little bit into the Cubs dust-up between Jake Arrieta and Miguel Montero. Also, some troubling news in our industry. I want to ask Nick's opinion on something. But let's get into a little bit more of what went down in New York today and what this means for the legacy of Phil Jackson. We're both Chicago-based people remembering Phil as one of the greatest sports coaches of all time, of any sport. And kind of an unceremonious or dramatic, I guess, is the better word for it, exit from New York, because this has been a long time coming for most Knicks fans and most analysts, wondering how he's hanging on so long. And what's interesting about Phil Jackson is that, by all accounts, he didn't want the job in the first place. And then by the end of it, it felt as though he was almost actively trying to be fired. People believed he was sabotaging his own job in order to get out of the contract that he didn't want to finish. Do you believe that at all, Nick? Do you think that there's any way that the moves he was making and the things he was saying were done with an actual honest and genuine intent to succeed?
Sarah, I don't believe that. When you have somebody who's had the immense amount of success that Phil Jackson's had, who's won 11 titles, you want to show that you can win. That's the only reason you're there, on top of getting paid. You want to prove that you can do this as well as anybody else. So I never bought that he was trying to really hurt himself and his team and his legacy by making the moves that he did. He just made the wrong moves.
So you think he's just out of it? You think he's just...
I mean, I think he just made move after move that wasn't right and made you shake your head. Going back to last summer with Joakim Noah, that contract is just awful. Going back to hiring Derek Fisher as a first-time head coach, that didn't work out. Forcing the team to still try to run the triangle, which by seemingly all accounts is an outdated offense that doesn't allow for younger players to have the most success that they would like. There are reasons that this didn't work, and a lot of it will always fall back on the decisions Phil Jackson has made. But not for 1 second do I believe that Phil wanted out so badly that he was making them on purpose to continue to lose this many games.
I can't decide what's worse, to be honest with you. I mean, I think it's terrible to trash a team on your way out and to be selfish enough to want out of a contract to the point where you sabotage. But at the same time, it's also terrible to imagine that this is who Phil Jackson is now. He feels like a guy that got left behind, whether that was him tweeting about, how's the three-point shooting approach going? Not great. And you're like, actually it is. The team's focusing on hitting from distance are having a great deal of success. Forcing the triangle, buying in on guys like Rose and Noah that are not worth the deals that they're giving them. It feels like the kind of guy who is stuck in stone and the rest of the league is passing him by. And I'm surprised. I'm surprised, not because I don't think he maybe has the ego of a guy who can get stuck in his ways, but because it felt like the person who was able to mold, the Rodmans and the Kobes and the Jordans would not be the same guy who would hit a certain point and then just stop evolving.
Yeah, Sarah, one of the defining characteristics of Phil's tenure, both as a player and a coach in the NBA, was the ability to adapt, to fit all these different pieces and all this different talent, both in Chicago and in L.A., into championship caliber teams. He had a way to manage egos, and he had a way of building teams up so that they were at their best, unified together when it mattered most. As a front office executive, that just wasn't the case. These teams, when you watch the Knicks, it looks like they weren't sure what to do offensively, both in Fisher's tenure and the first year of Jeff Hornacek. And even more, everybody just seemed unhappy. You listen to Carmelo Anthony, he seems unhappy with the direction that things have gone. Porzingis, in the last few weeks, he skipped that exit interview with Phil Jackson. He seems very unhappy. Like, all this time, you're thinking that Phil would set a direction that everybody else would follow. And it seems like as the years have gone on in these 3 years, Phil just hasn't been able to put the pieces together to make it work, and he's completely lost trust not only within the organization, but within a fan base that used to love him as a former player.
It's Nick Friedell and Sarah Spain filling in for Bomani on the right time. We're brought to you by Pennzoil Synthetics, taking synthetic motor oil performance to a whole new level. Make the switch to Pennzoil Synthetics today. As I mentioned, there was that stat from ESPN Stats and Info that over the last 3 years, the Knicks won 29.5 fewer games than expected compared to Vegas preseason over-unders. So giant underachievers. Even when the decisions he made for the roster weren't good, that roster that he compiled was still expected to do much better than it did. So it wasn't just, it wasn't the roster. It was also, hiring Derek Fisher, and the Derek Fisher tenure was terrible beyond just the Matt Barnes stuff. He just didn't really seem ready to be an NBA coach. They were 40-96 with Fisher there. He goes out and gets a bunch of old dudes. He traded J.R. Smith and Iman Shumpert to the Cavs for basically nothing, traded away Tyson Chandler for nothing. It was move after move that just didn't pan out. And, as I said before, I'm interested in what goes on in a guy within him as a person that can allow him to so precipitously fall from someone that we all respected. And I think a lot of people will say, oh, successes and failures as a GM won't really affect how we feel about him as a coach. I think it's almost impossible. He's not only someone who didn't succeed, he's become a laughingstock.
No doubt. No doubt. The whole image and aura of Phil Jackson, Sarah, prior to this job was that Phil was a winner. I mean, Phil won as a player. Phil won in a major way as a coach. And you're right. When you take the type of spins that he took and you make all these bad decisions, it all adds up. And I think the other thing that this marks is that there are no longer times when you can hire a name brand and just expect all the problems to go away. Like Dolan did here in New York. He hired Phil Jackson because Phil has won 11 different rings, and Phil has had success in molding clubs together. But when you have that kind of precipitous fall, this is the issue. I mean, you tell me, how many people walking down the street in Manhattan would be able to name R.C. Buford, who know who he is? It wouldn't happen. There just aren't that many people. But this guy repeatedly has put in place what he needed to have success in San Antonio. Now Phil Jackson comes into New York, and everybody was expecting everything to work out, and it's worked out so poorly and on such a grand scale that you hope, if you're a Knicks fan, that Dolan has finally learned from a mistake here, Sarah, and he just goes out and hires the best person for the job, not necessarily the best name.
Well, the parting gift for the Knicks that he has left is that new draft pick, whose name I cannot pronounce, Frank Ntilikina?
The N-Man.
Frank N. Drafted eighth overall by the Knicks just 6 days ago, injured his knee during practice. He was walking gingerly, had it taped up. We don't know yet how serious it is. This is coming out of the New York Daily News. It may be just a very mild thing, but it feels like for that to happen on the very day that they let go of Phil Jackson, that he's left a little parting gift in the form of a potentially injured young draft pick. Also worth noting, Nick, how this might affect the Carmelo Anthony situation. We have heard for a full season now that Carmelo Anthony wants to stay in New York. Phil Jackson is pressuring him to leave, both passive-aggressively, and then at the end they're just aggressively and openly and publicly asking him to leave. Now that he's gone, we had heard that Carmelo was finally starting to change his mind. All right, now maybe I'd be interested in a buyout. I'm not going to dig my heels into New York. I'll take a buyout. Well, you think James Dolan now is going to be, to acquiesce to his demands and say, all right, well, fine, we'll give you this big, huge chunk of money to leave, the same way that Phil Jackson might have.
Yeah, how much money is James Dolan willing to eat, Sarah?
Today, in the next week.
That's what it boils down to. How many different times is this guy going to write another huge check to make a problem disappear? I mean, in all honesty, if you're the Knicks, that's probably the way to go to wipe the slate completely clean. But this is why the Knicks continue to have so many different problems, because it starts from ownership on the way down. When you make this many bad deals, both with your star player in allowing him the no-trade clause and giving him all the money, and then with bringing in the guy who's running your organization, who has never had experience in a front office role before, but you love him because of his name and his previous success as a coach. When it all breaks down, that's where you look. You look at ownership. You look at why this continues to happen. And that's why fans in New York are so angry. They're always upset at Dolan. They have every right to be.
I would be angry, but at this point I'd also be basically despondent because, it may feel like a time for celebration that Phil Jackson is gone, but that also means that now you're left with James Dolan at the helm again and wondering how long until things get fixed. Steve Mills, the Knicks general manager, is going to stay in his current role. He's going to kind of be in charge during free agency. But you're right. It feels like until they, get rid of Dolan or until he finds a different person who knows what they're doing and then does the hands-off approach, things aren't going to get much better for them. It's just going to be a different way to watch them fail.
Yeah.
Sorry. I don't mean to be so negative, but it just feels sort of like a lost cause out there.
They've lost the benefit of the doubt, Sarah. And in pro sports, when you do that for paying customers, no matter how loyal they might have been over the years, when you have lost that, I don't think there's any coming back from that. So now here we go again with the Knicks starting over. But there's a reason they're always a train wreck, and the reason starts with Dolan and has continued to rear its ugly face time and time again.
Yes, that reason was playing a live show with his band during draft night.
The Right Time with Bomani Jones.
Welcome back to The Right Time on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app. Bomani is out. Nick Friedell and Sarah Spain in with you today. On this busy day of NBA news, Phil Jackson out in New York, Chris Paul headed to Houston, and we're happy to welcome in on the Shell Pennzoil Performance Line the undefeated's Mike Wise. We just talked to you, but now we got more to say, because even though we had you on Izzy in Spain last night, a whole bunch of news has changed the dynamics of the NBA. And let's start in New York, because I know you've been focused on Phil Jackson and exactly what was going on with his tenure in the Big Apple. And now it's over. I'm trying to be hopeful on behalf of Knicks fans because he's out of there, but I feel like the head of the snake is still there. And as long as James Dolan is there, I'm having trouble thinking of optimistic thoughts for their future.
The head of the snake is right, Sarah. This is probably too much information for you, Nick, but at one point in my life, before I met a woman and that I really made an effort to be in a relationship with, I was in all these other bad relationships that I would tell my friends about, like, yeah, she's this, she's that. And one day my friend went up to me and said, "Hey, dummy, you know who the common denominator in all these relationships is?" Well, guess what? Jim Dolan is the common denominator in every.
It was James Dolan. You kept trying to have a threesome with James Dolan, and it was always him.
Yeah, it was always him, and it was like, if Jim Dolan, if he sold the team, I'm convinced that Phil Jackson would have gone down as the greatest executive in the history of time. But I'm not going to put it all on him. Phil, somehow, I don't know. The weirdest thing is, I can't fathom, because I was in the locker room after he won his 10th title and his family was around him, and I'm thinking, man, I'm in a moment here with a guy who's got the palm of the world in his hands. He just won more championships than the great late Red Auerbach. And now it's sort of like he's in this league he doesn't recognize. Like, these players are forming teams on their own, and he can't do the tough love thing like he used to do with Shaquille O'Neal and Kobe Bryant and even Michael and Scotty. He essentially has to be this guy that sits back and watches things that happen to him. And it's just this guy was a star whisperer, Sarah, and now I don't know what he is. I mean, it's a shocker on many levels.
So, Mike, with that in mind, while we're on the topic of Phil, how much do you think that his time as the head of the Knicks in the last few years has dented his legacy?
I mean, right now it looks awful, and it's. I think if you are a old-time Knicks fan, or you're one of those kids whose parents told you about Action Jackson and how Phil was this great, a role player and cult hero on those 70s teams, and now he's the guy who's come back to save your franchise. I think there's always going to be that reservoir of goodwill in New York is gone, and if it's not gone, it's very low. But I think if you look, like, when the caravan passes of this week and we get through a couple seasons and Phil Jackson is either retired and happy and driving a motorcycle around Thailand, or he's recommending books to another player and burning sage, I think that Phil Jackson will go down as the greatest coach in league history that just never made the jump to an executive. And he'll be in a place, Nick, where people will say, well, like Dan Snyder in Washington with the football team, the same thing. Every coach that goes here, Mike Shanahan looked awful, but people will say in a couple of years, oh, well, he worked for Dan Snyder. What did you expect? And I think he'll always have that as a caveat, sort of. So I think all, it's not going to jeopardize the fact that he's already in the Hall of Fame. I just think that it's just too bad. It's like seeing your cool uncle get too old and all of a sudden he can't hear you anymore. That's what Phil was to me. The game, not the game passed him by, but the actual machinations and the way players had control over their careers like they never had before. I think that sort of flustered him in ways that he'll never really admit.
Yeah, and maybe you're right. Maybe we are a bit prisoners of the moment in thinking that it's forever tarnished. Maybe after a little bit of room to breathe, we'll be able to step away from this recent precipitous fall and reflect back on all the other stuff. Talking to Mike Wise, ESPN's senior writer at The Undefeated. What do you think happens next with Carmelo? He's been digging his heels and saying he wants to stay in New York. Phil was trying to push him out. Now he's pivoted to, all right, let's talk buyout. But Phil's not there anymore. The guy who wanted you out so badly is gone. Do you think that there's a chance Dolan will work with him on getting out of there?
I don't know. Yeah, I think it depends on what Carmelo's going to give him. Give him back money-wise. And I also think, if you're the franchise and you're Steve Mills, who's I guess in charge now, you have to ask yourself, well, how far is this going to go? Like, how far? Is Carmelo going to take days off? Is he just going to be one of these sour guys that just wants to get out of here and he's going to play himself out of here by not playing? Then you start to have those discussions. At some point, I think if an employee doesn't want to be there, you find a way to move them on. That's not crazy financial suicide for you, and so. Does Carmelo move on this year? I don't know. I still think that they try and put one more person in place, and they try and get one more year out of him. But also, man, there's so much going on. I mean, this Chris Paul thing. Chris Paul essentially orchestrated that trade, and he basically went into the Rockets went into the Clippers and said, "Hey, you guys can lose me for nothing in 48 hours, or you can get something for me because this is where I want to go." And so, props to him for telling Doc Rivers that, because at least they got something. But Doc Rivers is probably thinking, wait a minute, you're my employee. I'm the team president. And you know what? We don't live in that world anymore. And so that being said, I wouldn't be surprised if Carmelo ended up with another team. I mean, I talked to Doc a few nights ago, and most of it was off the record. But I remember one thing he said to me was, he was really worried about the whole super team thing. Like, where players if you were an all-star, perennial all-star now, you were in your head, you were thinking, wait a minute, I got to go build my team. What am I thinking? And clearly that's happening.
Mike, to that point, do you think it's bad for the league, as somebody who's covered the league for as long as you have, that all these stars are pairing up, and then you start seasons with only a few teams that have the ability to potentially win a title?
Well, they always, believe it or not, the NBA always operated on that premise, even during the Lakers-Celtics days. But at least then, like, if you were the Lakers and Celtics, you had, like, on the Celtics side in the Eastern Conference, you had the Pistons, and you had the Sixers, and then the Bulls. And you always had somebody to fight you on your way to the title or to the finals. And the same with the Lakers. They had the Blazers. They had the Mavericks for years, who were probably one of the great teams to never make the finals, like Derek Harper and all those great Maverick teams. But it's like nowadays, like, you could have went into this season and said, there are two teams that are going to end up in the finals, and I know what they are already. If you don't get at least 4 to 5 teams that have the potential to win it all, then you run the risk as a league of alienating a lot of your fan base to the point where it's great to have a villain team. It's great to have a team that everybody considers the Beatles, and they all want to, gawk at, and you want to put your marketing plan around if you're a sad team. But look, you can't just have the Warriors and the Cavaliers meeting for 5 years in a row. It's a great 30 for 30 in 20 years, but it also makes Milwaukee, Washington, and Portland and everywhere else look at each other and go, what were we even doing? Like, what kind of league was that?
Yeah, it's like you said, I don't think necessarily the game entirely passed by, Phil, but as we're seeing all of these power structures change, it will be interesting to see who reacts the fastest and which teams are able to best counteract players having a lot more power than they used to. Thanks so much for making time for us, Mike. Really appreciate it.
Guys, have a great rest of the day and rest of the week.
Okay, keep your eyes closed.
Okay.
I want to show you my first ever painting.
All right.
Okay. Open your eyes.
Oh, that's a lot of colors and shades.
So be honest. What do you think?
Well, I like how if you switch to Geico, you could save hundreds of dollars on car insurance.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Here, why don't I hold your paintbrush while you call them?
Geico, because saving 15% or more on car insurance is always a great answer.
The Right Time with Bomani Jones.
Sarah Spain and Nick Friedell filling in. Nick, I'm just going to call this segment the Get Off My Lawn segment. I'm feeling old today. We talked the other day about young upstart Cody Bellinger not knowing who Seinfeld is. That made me feel old. And then I'm seeing in our industry, in our sports industry across a lot of websites, including Fox Sports Net or Fox Sports 1 and MTV News today, announcing a bunch of cuts as well. That a lot of places are going for the video over the writing, and they're trying to emphasize video to the point of laying off almost their entire writing staff. And I don't know if you're like me, but I would much rather read a story than watch a video. Much rather.
Absolutely. That's the way I grew up reading stories. I'm not to a point, and I don't think I ever will be, where I only want video content of anything.
Well, it's frustrating because actually Nate Silver from 538 just tweeted out, has there been a company that's pivoted to video entirely and shown an increase in profit? I guess what we'll have to see is whether this decision actually responds, the way that these places want. Is it going to result in actual profit driving, or is it just a last-ditch effort or a pivot that you feel like you need to do something? And I don't necessarily blame the places doing it so much as I'm frustrated with the audience, right? That people are wanting everything in emoji and GIF and video form instead of wanting to read.
Everything is for shorter and smaller consumption. Right.
Very, very short time attention spans, which is understandable. There's so much around. There's so much to digest. You can get news from a million different places, but that doesn't necessarily take away from the benefit and the depth and importance of real reporting and well-written stuff. That just doesn't come across the same way in a 2-minute video. But yeah, I realize that we sound old saying that, and that there's a lot of youngsters who would rather get all their content via video. So hopefully all of those good folks at those places will find new jobs soon. You hate to see that, especially in favor of videos, in my opinion. But times they are changing. We can't Phil Jackson it, right, Nick? We gotta stay on top of things. We gotta Snapchat and learn this Marco Polo thing everybody's doing now. We gotta jump on board with that.
I don't even know what you're talking about, but as far as Phil Jackson, and Phil Jackson and it goes, if somebody wants to write me a check for a few mega millions,
$50,000 a day,
yeah, then I'm on board for that. I'm going straight to San Diego and buy my beach house.
There you go. All you ask is $50,000 a day to completely tank a franchise. Wow, it's very generous of you.
I mean, I'm a people pleaser, Sarah.
Yeah. The other thing that had me thinking that I'm, feeling a little get off my lawn today is Darren Ravel reporting the renovations for the Hawks' new Phillips Arena. Now, keep in mind, this arena is a $192.5 million renovation. The Atlanta City Council approved the funding, and according to the Associated Press, the Hawks are giving $50 million. The city's sale of Turner Field to Georgia State University is amounting to $32.5 million, and then $110 million of it will come from car rental tax at the Atlanta airport. So to all the writers that are still writers being sent to Atlanta to cover the Hawks, your car rental tax just went way up because now you are paying for a barber shop, 2 top flight simulator swing suites, and a bar courtside with a view of the court on the same level, right behind the bucket. I don't want to sound like a Debbie Downer, Nick, but this seems unnecessary to me. Just go watch the basketball game.
This is what it takes, though, to spend that entertainment dollar. I was cracked up because when you teased the segment, Sarah, I grew up in Orlando, Florida, and a buddy of mine, before you had mentioned the Hawks, said... I said, are you thinking to yourself, I like going to NBA games, but I'm not close enough or drunk enough? Right.
And I've got the answer for you.
Right. And he said, nobody's drunk enough to watch the Magic right now. So in that realm, if you're a Hawks fan, yeah, the team, it's had some nice years in the last few seasons, but it's on a downswing right now. if the whole goal is to get fans in there and to entertain them, I'm all about trying something different. But I can tell you, having gone to all these different arenas and all my time covering the league, the thing that has always driven me nuts, as somebody who has grown up as a basketball fan my whole life, is all these arenas where you're taking fans out of their seats and they're not really watching the game. Right. And I feel like this is another example of that. You've got a courtside bar, which will certainly be, you would think, very cool to hang out in, but who's going to watch the game? You're just more there for the event, and you're going to take fans' interest level, I would think, and their focus a long way away from the floor where it should be.
Yeah, the bar doesn't bother me as much because I know, the Blackhawks and some of the arenas have bars that are kind of, they open out and on an upper level, so you can kind of get your drink and hang out and watch. But this one is courtside, and I think people will still, be keeping their eye on it while they're mingling and sipping. But to me, it's like, why do you need to get a haircut at an NBA game? And the barbershop has a view of the court. Why do you need to have Top Golf? It's funny to me that for so long we talked about how baseball was going to phase out because people just don't have the attention span to watch a slower game that develops over time, that has these big gaps in between pitches and stuff. If the NBA isn't exciting enough for you and fast-paced enough for you, I'm not sure what will be. And like I said, I don't want to be the get off my lawn person. It just seems to me that if you go to an NBA game, it should be enough that you have the basketball and the big screen playing music and live performances and dancers and food and contests and T-shirt cannons. I mean, it feels like Idiocracy, where we have to constantly, every second, there needs to be some sort of appeal to our senses.
Yeah, but think about the new pickup lines that have come out of this, Sarah. Hey, baby, you want to go with me and go check out some Top Golf at the basketball game?
Yeah. Yeah,
I mean,
and while I get a haircut, and then we go get a drink.
We can hit the courtside club and go hang out and check out what's going on. I mean, hey,
man,
whatever
old.
Gets people in the building.
Back in my day, I could just sit and watch a basketball game.
get a beer and some popcorn. I mean,
exactly. No, now you need sushi and a taco that's half hot dog and half hamburger in a taco. Now I really sound old.
The Right Time with Bomani Jones.
All this NBA news has us wondering, do we think it's possible that the offseason has now become more exciting than the regular season, Nick? We dogged the regular season all year, and we can't get enough of the offseason.
Absolutely, Sarah. As somebody who covers the league, I think fans have more interest in what happens now prior to the draft and what happens during free agency than they do during the year. I mean, I think it's a fact because all teams are involved and all fans are interested in where the next player is going to land. And Shannon, I know before the show we were talking about this, but you made a great point. It started that summer around 2010 when LeBron and all those guys got together.
Oh, 2010 totally legitimized this whole thing, because prior to that, we would have never gave a second thought about a team being able to amass 3 max contract players like they did with Wade, Bosh, and LeBron. But post-2010, you got to pay attention to any kind of speculation, any rumor, any kind of whisper of a player or team or any kind of a transaction. You have to at least acknowledge it now. Like prior to going back to last year, you would have never said, hey, Houston Rockets, they do well when James Harden is ball dominant and has the ball. There's no way they'll be able to trade for Chris Paul. And here we are today, June 28th, talking about Chris Paul being traded to Houston.
Right, and so much of that is because star players, really great players, cannot have an ego anymore that tells them I'll do this alone. The days of Derrick Rose saying, I'm not recruiting, are over. If you are even the best player, if you're Kevin Durant, you're still sucking it up and going to the team that beat you. Because that's the only way to win now is these super teams. And that's a huge part of it is that it doesn't feel like if a team already has a star or two that they're done collecting assets.
Absolutely. And to me, and to Shannon's point, Sarah, the thing that always struck me, there's one picture that I still remember, and that was Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh sitting at the dinner table at a restaurant. And there was an open chair. And you're thinking to yourself at that time, you're like, no way, LeBron's going to join up with all 3 of those guys? And they're going to form this team. How's the money going to work? How's it going to work on the floor? How are all these things going to come together? And then lo and behold, they all signed down in Miami, and they changed the course of the NBA's future. And from a reality TV perspective and a social media reality, it is great for the league because you have this second season that is so robust with rumors and potential landing places and all these different things that have to happen or might happen for different teams. My fear is, as somebody whose livelihood is based in large part on the league itself, guys, I don't know if it's good for the health of the game long term. I think everybody gets so excited with these rumors and these possibilities, but when you start watching the same teams collect the same high-level players, where does that leave everybody else?
Yeah, and I think it as much as we're excited now, I think a lot of the conversation just ends up going to the same spot, which is, wow, what a great deal. They're still not going to beat the Warriors every time, right? No matter what.
Right.
And or what's the point of Paul George going anywhere other than the Cavs? The Cavs are the only team that's one Paul George away from being at least remotely competitive. And that's tough. And we might all be overselling it. You know, the Warriors did end up losing last year when we thought they were unbeatable and people were saying Steph Curry was the greatest player that's ever played. So, you know, we might be jumping ahead of things, but it certainly feels like we're basing everything that's done in the NBA on whether or not it will give them a lead or like a chance against the Warriors. And unfortunately, right now, it doesn't feel like most things will.
Thanks for listening to the Right Time Podcast. Please come back tomorrow for more. And don't forget to listen to The Right Time with Bomani Jones from 4 p.m. to 7 Eastern on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app.